So welcome one and all. Very great to see so many people taking an interest in our community. This is our second community information seminar that we've held. A bit of a rejigging of the way that Council is doing things, in that we've now moved to once a month meetings. We want to make sure that that provides us with an opportunity to engage with our community, and it has freed up a spare Monday. So rather than giving the councillors a day off, we thought, no, we'll do this community information seminar and provide the opportunity for you not only to hear from councillors to what we're going, but also interact with the councillors and also staff. And I'll just introduce the councillors here. Councillor Craig Campbell, and I'll get you to stand up so everyone knows who you are. Councillor Craig, who's our newly appointed Deputy Mayor. Well done, Craig. Lovely to be here. Councillor Kristin Chion. Christine, welcome. Councillor Tony Mustaka. Welcome, Tony. Councillor Brendan Zhu. Welcome, Brendan. And we've got Councillor Dennis Fernandez. Welcome, Dennis. And Councillor Wendy Norton. And then in the back stalls over here, I think we've got Councillor... Councillor Saville's popped up. There we are. Councillor Saville, welcome. And Councillor Angelo Rosos. Good to see so many of our councillors supporting this event this evening. And we've also got senior members of staff, and we will be staying behind afterwards if you've got particular questions or queries. Our CEO, Deborah Just. Welcome, Deborah. Mel Smith from Community Services. Yep, Community and Leisure. Okay, and Dean Frost, Corporate Services. And I did see Greg here somewhere. Oh, there he is. Greg, welcome. So these members are our senior executive leadership team. So the buck stops with them, basically. Yeah. Okay, and we are talking this evening about all things environment. So as we're discussing the environment and the place we live, it is only appropriate that, of course, we acknowledge the traditional inhabitants of the land where we're meeting today, the Aboriginal people, their spirits and ancestors. And I want to particularly acknowledge the vital contribution that the Aboriginal people have made and still make to this nation that we share, Australia. I also need to advise you that you are on candid camera. Yes, we are going to be recording these information seminars, so they will be available, the presentations will be available on the website following this meeting. I think in a week or so, something like that, they'll be available. We won't be filming the question time, but the presentations will be available for you to go and reflect on for the next 2 years. So that's exciting. We are welcoming questions, but I would ask that you hold your questions to the end, please, just so the presenters can get through the material in a timely way. Then we'll have plenty of time for questions before we move on. And we are, they've got here on my notes, be courteous. Of course you're going to be courteous when you ask questions. I don't even have to mention that, do I? And we've got two sessions this evening, one being Resilient Sydney, which is the Metropolitan Sydney collaboration, and you'll hear a bit more about that. And also our Green City Plan 2028. We've done a lot of work on that, got about 7,000 responses from our community who have told us that being a green city is very important to them. And the only thing that I've also neglected to mention is tell you who I am. My name is Gail Giles Gidney, and I am the Mayor of Willoughby City Council, very proud Mayor of this wonderful city. So without any further ado, we'll move on to our first presentation on the Resilient Sydney. And I've got a great deal of pleasure in introducing Kristin Gabriel. And Kristin is the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer for Metropolitan Sydney. It's hosted by the City of Sydney Council as part of the 100 Resilient Cities Network. And Kristin developed and implemented the Metropolitan-wide community research program to develop the Resilient Sydney strategy. So welcome, Kristin. Can we all welcome her? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. As you've heard, I work on a project called Resilient Sydney, and it's part of the 100 Resilient Cities initiative that was pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation to help cities across the world manage the increasing challenges of the 21st century around disruption and disaster. So we started here in Sydney in late 2015. We've been going for about 4 years, and we released a resilience strategy for Metropolitan Sydney in July last year. So we are now implementing that strategy. So in this presentation, I'm going to start by doing a little bit of kind of context setting, a bit of scene setting for the 100 Resilient Cities program. And then I'm going to talk to you about how we developed our strategy here in Metropolitan Sydney, the kind of actions that we're taking, that we're undertaking to implement that strategy, as well as a few ideas that you can consider as community members and residents in terms of strengthening resilience in your local areas and contributing more broadly to resilience across Metropolitan Sydney. So, as I said, we've been going for about 4 years here in Sydney, and so we give these presentations somewhat regularly. And it's been a very sad and unfortunate fact that almost any time that we've given these presentations, we've been able to cast our minds back over the last month, 2 months, 6 months, etc., and identify a range of disasters that have been facing people in cities across the world. And unfortunately, right now is no exception. So if we just think about what's been happening here in Australia over the last 2 weeks, of course we've had bushfires, people in New South Wales and particularly Queensland facing bushfires, exacerbated of course by those extreme drought conditions in regional and rural Australia. If we look over the last month, we have Cyclone Dorian that hit the Bahamas. It was the worst tropical cyclone in recorded history for that nation. So we have 70,000 people in the Bahamas that are displaced without food, shelter, and in places like Marsh Harbour, 95% of the infrastructure has been destroyed. And then if we look further back over the last 6 months, because we don't unfortunately just deal with natural disasters in this program, if we look at Christchurch and the gunman who opened fire on the 2 mosques in Christchurch, Christchurch is also actually part of the 100 Resilient Cities network. So this is a very timely intervention on behalf of the Rockefeller Foundation because these events don't seem to be going away, and in fact they are increasingly people in cities are increasingly facing these kinds of events. So the definition of urban resilience from 100 Resilient Cities is really all about capacity. It's about the capacity of all of the people and of the businesses and the organisations in a city to survive, adapt and thrive, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they face. So acute shocks are the kind of disaster events that I've been talking about up until now, whereas the chronic stresses are the long, kind of insidious, slow burn issues that will be undermining our cities every day. And so these are things like rising intolerance, lack of affordable housing and so on. And the program asks each city to understand its risks in terms of shocks and stresses, and particularly to look at them together, because we want to understand their capacity to interact with and amplify one another. And so the example that we often give to illustrate this point is around levels of social cohesion, because there's been enough study done worldwide that we know that the levels of social cohesion that exist in a place, in a city before a disaster strikes, are critical in determining how that city responds to and recovers from the disaster. And in fact, social cohesion is pretty much more important than any other factor. So it's more important than the amount of damage is done, than the kind of damage that's done in the disaster event, and it's more important than things like the amount of post-event disaster recovery funding that's poured into a city. The flip side of this, of course, is also true, in that the disaster event can often act as the kind of lightning rod that illuminates all of those kind of day-to-day dysfunctions that we've been conveniently ignoring and putting on the back burner. So if we think about a city like New Orleans, and we think about an event like Hurricane Katrina, it was the event that showed the entire world all those decades, if not centuries, of dysfunction around racial inequity, around poor social cohesion, poor land use planning decisions, and so on. So I think this is really important to grasp this definition because it is the fundamental value proposition for our entire program. And that is that you manage those day-to-day problems because they matter every day and because they also have this unique capacity to amplify your risk profile under a disaster scenario. So moving on to talk about Sydney. I think one of the first things to note about our program is its geographic scale. We deal with Metropolitan Sydney, so we work all the way from the Hawkesbury in the north, we include the Blue Mountains in the west, and we go down to Wollondilly and Sutherland Shire in the south. And this geographic scale is really important because 100 Resilient Cities was conceptualised around the governance structures that exist in North American cities and in probably most cities around the world. And this is where you have a single unitary authority with strategic decision making and operational control over a metropolitan city area. So if we think about the Mayor of New York and his administration, they have something like a $7 billion annual operating budget, and they have charge over all 5 boroughs of the metropolitan New York City area. And so they, when I say charge, I mean they have strategic decision-making, operational control over transportation, infrastructure, land use planning, health services, education, you can go on. And so if you think about how those things work in Australian cities, if you think about somewhere like Sydney, you know, we have 3 layers of government and they all have jurisdiction, some jurisdiction over metropolitan Sydney. At the moment, we have 33 councils on a local level. So we've done the maths and we reckon that here in Sydney, we've got upwards of about 100 separate organisations collectively doing the work of one administration in New York. And so this has been critical in determining our kind of historical ability or inability to understand the risks that face us on this specific geographic scale, and also to do things like take action to address the risks. I mean, if you think about it in terms of kind of a data collection exercise and having to collect consistent data over 100 separate organisations, it's a massive challenge. So it's been critical in determining how we've developed our Resilient Sydney program, including how we've developed the governance for Resilient Sydney. So we have a Metropolitan Sydney Steering Committee, and the Greater Sydney Land Use Planning Commission has divided Sydney up into planning districts. There are now 5. And so on our steering committee, we have a general manager from a council in every single one of those planning districts. So that's that kind of geographic representation at that local level. We have 3 representatives from the state government. So we have the Director of the Office of Emergency Management, the Environment Commissioner sits on our steering committee from the Greater Sydney Commission, as well as a director from what was the Office of Environment and Heritage. It's now changed its acronym, DPI. We have 2 representatives from business, somebody from IAG, another person from Deloitte, and somebody from the Red Cross. We also have a group of what we call our resilience ambassadors. So we have a representative from every single council across Metropolitan Sydney, and they come together about once a quarter. They have been giving input into our strategy as we've developed our strategy, and it's now become a very nice 2-way process now that we've released the strategy, so that they're kind of charged with taking resilience back into their organisations and their local areas and embedding resilience within those operations. We also work with the other layers of government. As you can see, we participate on working groups for the National Resilience Task Force and with a number of those state government agencies. So in terms of our program, we've developed Resilient Sydney over 3 phases, and all of the cities in this program move through these 3 phases. And the first phase is a big research and engagement phase where we do effectively a giant risk assessment for our metropolitan city. We use that information around those risks and the challenges that we've identified in order to develop up a strategy with solutions and actions that address the challenges. And we did that a little bit differently here in Sydney to the way that some of the other cities have done it, in that we developed our strategy via a broad-scale engagement exercise. So we engaged with stakeholders from government, business, community services, the arts and so on, and we also engaged with our communities in Metropolitan Sydney. So we had an external recruitment agency randomly select and recruit groups of people in each of those planning districts, and we asked them to broadly match the demographics in each part of town. So we consulted with all of those stakeholders, gave them all the same information, asked them all a consistent set of questions, and then we used that feedback in order to develop the strategy, which, as I've said, we launched out in July last year. So for this next part of the presentation, I'm going to present to you the outcomes of that early phase of research that we did when we conducted this big risk assessment for Metropolitan Sydney. This first slide here are the top 8 shocks that we face across our city And these are the top 8 shocks. There's a long list of other risks that lie under this. This is all available online on the Resilient Sydney website, all of our study and our research. I'm not going to go through all of these icons because I'm hoping that they make some intuitive sense, but I will say that the bigger the bubble, the bigger the issue. And so as you can see, the biggest bubble here is extreme weather. And so within this category, there are things like storms and floods and bushfires. But at the top of the list is extreme heat. Extreme heat is described as our silent killer. It kills more people per year than any other natural disaster in Sydney. I think it's also probably important to just note that these are the shocks that 100% of Sydney-siders face. But in terms of how they impact you and how they play out in your local area, it obviously matters very much who you are and where you are. So for instance, with a heat wave, it's very different experiencing a heat wave if you're standing in somewhere like Manly to what it's like if you're standing in somewhere like Blacktown. As I said, I won't go through all of these. I will just point out financial institution failure. This is about our kind of exposure to another GFC type event, but it's also about things like our levels of household debt, because they are amongst the highest in the world, and this is related to lack of affordable housing. And so what this means is that we have millions of people across our city that are so heavily mortgaged and paying so much in rent that there's very little put aside in their personal finances for a rainy day, let alone something like a bushfire. In terms of the stresses, again, these are the top 8, and again, the bigger the bubble, the bigger the problem. So as you can see, health services are a big issue for Metropolitan Sydney, and I think there's been a fair bit of discussion about this, certainly in the last month in the media. I know the Four Corners did a program on health services across Australia, so this is an issue for our city as much as it is anywhere else. We have housing affordability, again, I've already mentioned that across Metropolitan Sydney. And then we have issues like social cohesion. So we are currently looking at declining levels of community connectedness across Sydney in terms of social cohesion, and particularly around issues like rising intolerance of cultural diversity. And then I think the other one I really want to pull out is our small but rather defining bubble on the bottom, which is around inequity. And we describe inequity as being about opportunities to thrive and prosper. And this is, we're recognising that there are pockets of inequity right across Metropolitan Sydney, and so that you'll have people who are doing it really tough in some of the more affluent areas, and they'll be living side by side with people who are much better off. And I think sometimes that kind of social pressure to look as though you're doing okay can be fairly isolating in those situations. This is about those issues. It's also about that geographic dividing line that people used to call the latte line, sort of from northeast to southwest. And it's recognising that we have a real concentration of things like well-paid jobs, 5 of Sydney's 6 universities are in the east of the city. We've got good transport networks and infrastructure, etc., all kind of concentrated here on the eastern side, and it gets much tougher as you move towards the west and the southwest, so the growing parts of our city. So these are the challenges and the risks that we presented during our engagement process. And across all of the stakeholder groups that we consulted with, we got a really consistent response in terms of priorities. But I will say that these priorities were articulated most clearly by the community. And I think this is because we were really talking to people about their lives. And so at the top of the list was the need for governance reform, and there was a really strong sense from our community that for the most part, the things in their lives that were difficult were, they were not seeing them mostly as the product of poor personal choices in their history, but they were often the outcome of decisions that other people had historically been making about our city and shaping their lives. They were also very explicit in calling out kind of the dysfunction that they saw between the layers of government, and I think this tendency to sort of pull to disaggregate decisions that are actually connected in people's lives. We had widespread concern around extreme weather and a real frustration about inaction around addressing climate change, and this was across the entire all of the geographies of Metropolitan Sydney. We also had a lot of concern around declining social cohesion, and that was a priority for our community. And then overwhelmingly, people were feeling as though they were unprepared for a disaster. And I think for many people, before they walked into our workshops, many people probably hadn't really thought very much about what they would do in an emergency. And so this was kind of just striking them. And the idea that they were unprepared for those kinds of events was really quite frightening for a lot of people. So we used this feedback and we kind of unpacked it and turned it into the directions of the Resilient Sydney strategy. And so you can see that process here on the screen. So we have this concern around growing inequity, and it turned into our direction, people-centred city. We had the concern around lack of action around extreme weather, extreme heat, and so on, has turned into live with the climate. Decline in social cohesion has turned into connect for strength. Lack of community understanding and preparedness has turned into get ready. And these issues around governance fragmentation has turned into the one city direction. So, the Resilient Sydney strategy, as you can see, here are the directions laid out. And so for this final part of the presentation, what I'm going to do is going to go through each direction, and I'm going to talk about one of the key actions that we are either implementing right now or that is in the process of development for each direction. And then I'm going to give an overview of a couple of ideas that, as I said before, that you can think about as community members in order to address some of the challenges that exist in each of these directions. So for this first one, around people-centred city, as I said before, I think this is really best described as a recognition that if historically we've been making sensible decisions about our city, we would have distributed, great education opportunities, good transport networks, infrastructure services and so on, more evenly across the geographies of our city, and most certainly where the people are living increasingly. And so this is really all about decision making. And so the key action for this direction is about a Metropolitan Engagement Practitioners Network. And so within almost every council, depending on how they're resourced across Metropolitan Sydney, there is either a person who has a role that's dedicated to community and stakeholder engagement, or else it's part of their role. And this is true also of many of the state government agencies. They'll have sort of dedicated teams and so on. This is about connecting all of those practitioners in a place-based network. And the ambition for this action is that we will be developing, again, a place-based engagement standard. And so there'll be two components to the standard. And the first component will be around how we engage with our communities, about ensuring that we're using high-quality engagement practices that are designed to reduce bias in the kind of feedback that we get, so that we're hearing from a representative range of our community, including people who are vulnerable and maybe a little harder to reach. That we're using accessible, inclusive processes, that we were providing people with accessible information and enough information that they can give informed feedback. And then the other component, or the other side of the standard, is of course around the decisions that pop out the other end of these processes, and ensuring that the community view, that you can see the community view reflected in the decision at the other end. And so from a residents' community action standpoint, this is literally all about your participation in democratic processes. And so we see this existing on kind of almost at two scales. So you've got the kind of the more broad structural strategic level, and then whatever you might be doing on a local grassroots level. So from that broad strategic level, I mean, this is literally about the kinds of questions that we are, or the kinds of issues that we are asking, that our political parties and our local members, that we're asking them to address. This is about how we inform ourselves as we are getting ready to vote, whether we are going to a variety of news services so that we are kind of fact-checking the information that we're receiving, and about ensuring that we're making informed voting decisions. Having said that, we recognise that it's a long time between elections, and so this is also about civic participation on a more grassroots local level. And so, I think I've looked online, and Willoughby Council certainly has a great Have Your Say webpage, so it's about keeping your eye on all of those opportunities to be involved in local decisions. It's about turning up to forums like this. So quite frankly, you're all getting a gold star in terms of civic participation. But then it's also about looking around the room and recognising who's not here. And so it's about recognising that there's probably somebody in your local area who either doesn't know about this forum, or maybe they don't feel like it's for them, and they're not, they're not used to engaging in this way. Or maybe it's somebody who's moved here from some other part of the world and actually just doesn't know how these processes work. So your job basically is the next one of these that you come along to, that you bring somebody else who might not normally turn up. The other thing that I really want to say about these local decisions is that it's important that you have your say, obviously, in the local government issues in your local council, but it's also about recognising that local government is still somewhat constrained in terms of how we deal with these strategic issues, in that local government operates within a regulatory framework that is generally set by the state government. So this is about ensuring that your views are reflected on that strategic level, because the state infrastructure plan, transportation, land use planning, the regional plan, etc., there are always opportunities for you to engage when those plans come along, and it is really vital that you keep your eye out for those opportunities so that your voices and your views are reflected there. So the next direction is around addressing our biggest risk in Sydney in terms of shocks, which is around extreme weather. And the flagship action that we have here is called Cool Suburbs. This is about developing a suite of interventions that can be used by councils and housing developers and by state government agencies, all kinds of organisations that will give a cooling outcome in a place. So for instance, if you're a council and you have responsibility over the streetscape, this is about whatever guidelines might exist around how many trees you plant along the pavement, whether you're using light reflective surfaces in pavements so that it's not bitumen that's absorbing heat and reflecting it back off into the atmosphere. But if you're a housing developer, it's about the kind of building materials that you're using as you develop housing, and making sure that again they're the light coloured materials, that you're using proper thermal insulation, that we're developing houses with proper eaves and awnings and green space so that there are yards, etc., and again planting trees around houses. At the other end of this, we will be developing a ratings tool, and this will give the consumer the kind of transparency around and reporting around the place that they're about to move into, so that they will understand whether that house and whether that neighbourhood will keep them safe and comfortable during a heat wave. This is actually a pilot project that we are rolling out in Western Sydney because, quite frankly, it's the hottest part of Sydney. But as I said, it's a pilot, so it's something that we would obviously be looking at scaling to other parts of our city. I think, again, on a household to household level, this is certainly a direction that there's plenty of action that communities can take. And the first thing is really that in extreme weather, in something like a heat wave, we all have a responsibility to keep ourselves safe. So this is about, during summer, identifying the cool refuges, identifying the public air-conditioned spaces. We're in one now. We've got the library down at Chatswood, we've got Westfield, etc. So those air-conditioned spaces that if you're out running errands in the middle of the day and it's really hot, that you've got somewhere that you can kind of retreat to under those circumstances. This is also actually about recognising that there are vulnerable people in our community, and maybe you have a neighbour who can't afford air conditioning, they might be unwell or elderly or vulnerable in some other way, and it's about just clocking that, when there's a heat wave, maybe it's been a little bit too hot, a little bit too long, and so that you're going down the road, knocking on the door and just checking if that person's okay. Again, it's about checking on also remembering your pets in heat waves and in other extreme weather events, because it's important that we keep, everybody in our network safe. When we renovate our houses, when we build new houses, that's obviously an opportunity where you have to make choices about the kind of building materials you're using. As I said before when I was talking about the flagship action here, about ensuring you have proper insulation. If you have the opportunity to install something like renewable solar energy, something that gives you some redundancy so that if there's a blackout, you've got some backup in your own household. And of course, this is about getting involved in those local greening initiatives. So this is about bush care, it's about community gardening, it's about caring for plants in your streetscape, because quite frankly, that is extremely for councils to be involved in. So as much as communities can get involved in that kind of thing, the better. So the next direction, Connect for Strength, this is around addressing all of our issues around community connectedness and cohesion. And the flagship action here is about developing a methodology, a consistent methodology for measuring and monitoring social cohesion across Metropolitan Sydney. And so this is because we've recognised that on a community level, there is so much for want of a better term, investment in community connections. So whether this be book clubs or the P&C or sporting clubs, or whether it be the council-run initiatives where we have seniors programs in the libraries, or Meals on Wheels, volunteering, etc. So there's, as I said, enormous effort is put into community building activities, but currently we have no way of understanding whether they're working and whether we're getting kind of a return on that investment. So this is, as I said, about developing a consistent set of measures and indicators that we would be able to use across our entire city and being able to track social cohesion over time. So I think, again, this is, with this direction, there is plenty that communities are already doing, and I would just encourage you to keep doing those things. Remember that it's about forging connections also with people who live in other parts of our city. So it's almost like these actions are always on a couple of scales, so that we're forging connections across Metropolitan Sydney, but we're also focusing on our friendships and our networks locally. Because, if a disaster were to strike, it is the people in your local area who would have your back, and again, who you would have a responsibility for. So as you can see, anything, sporting clubs, book clubs, community gardening, Meals on Wheels, any of those kinds of initiatives are really critical. Okay, so get ready. This is about community preparedness. We are currently in the Red Cross National Disaster Preparedness Week, and this is our flagship action. It is actually a community preparedness action. And probably for the first time in any of my presentations, I'm going to encourage you to get on your phones. This app can be found at in the App Store, and I would encourage all of you to download the Get Prepared app. It is very, very easy to use. So it asks you your address, and then it pops up a list of the risks that you face in the area that you live, and leads you through this very easy interactive process of developing an emergency plan that you can share with other people in your household and in your local area. So we're encouraging everybody in all of our council areas to download this app and to go through that process. Okay, so finally, the last direction, One City, is about addressing our issues around governance fragmentation, and the flagship action for this one is called 100 Resilient Organisations, and this is about recruiting those 100 separate organisations that I described in the beginning and asking them to make a resilience commitment. And so when I was developing this presentation, I'm thinking, this direction really is, mostly about businesses and government. It's about an organisational response in terms of resilience. But then I was thinking, what is the checklist of things that exist in the, that we've developed as part of this resilience commitment? So there's a checklist of issues that we want organisations to tick off against, and it is actually exactly the same checklist that we would give to anyone, to community members, anyone in Sydney. And so the first one is, and this is probably a key message of this whole presentation, is that it's vital that we all understand our risks, that we understand the risks that exist across Metropolitan Sydney and how they play out in our local areas. It's about identifying our role in managing those risks. So it's literally about who do you have a duty of care or responsibility towards. So as I said before, certainly yourself, keeping yourself safe in an emergency, but also, thinking about your family, about your work colleagues, your friends, and people in your local area, your pets and so on. And then this is always about collaboration, because as I've said, in terms of these issues that we have around decision making, around action, there is no single person, no single individual, and no single organisation that can do this work themselves. And so on a community level, as much as on an organisational level, this is literally about connecting with your network and making these plans together. And the final thing that we're saying to everyone is that once you have gone through that checklist yourself, it's really time to look around at everybody else across Sydney and all the other organisations and people across our city and say, well, look, I've done what I can, and advocating that other organisations and other people are taking actions as well. So that's it. Thank you.